Welcome to Big Blend Radio, where we celebrate variety and how it adds spice to quality of life. Welcome, everybody. Today on our Big Blend Radio Toast of the Art Show, we're chatting with Leo Daughtry. His debut historical fiction novel is out June 4th, 2024, just in case. It's called Talmadge Farm, and I love this because we love North Carolina, and there's such a diverse and complex history that comes with this state and anywhere in the South, really. But this novel really looks at the change and resilience among the people and the tobacco fields of the 1950s in North Carolina. Nance and I traveled the country, and we've spent a lot of time in the regions that he talks about in his book. Again, it's called Talmadge Farm. And am I even pronouncing that right, Leo? Welcome. How are you?
Well, thank you very much. And you certainly are pronouncing it correct.
Talmadge it's kind of feels Scottish or British to me. Where did that name come from?
Well, to tell you the truth, it came out of my head. I didn't know anyone around where I lived named Talmadge, and so I figured I wouldn't insult anybody by naming the book Talmadge. I didn't know anyone named Talmadge.
And writing this, because you are based in North Carolina, right? So
Correct.
yeah, and you've been a lawyer in the U.S. military. You've been in politics. Oh, let's get into politics now. No, let's not.
Let's
It's a
don't do
great.
that.
No, let's don't do that. It's
That's
a
not a good
crazy
time.
year. No, it's not. It's a crazy year. Can we just be over with it now? But I think what's interesting is I think lawyers always somehow end up writing a novel, and a lot of times it's historical because you guys see things from two sides of the coin. And I think this story, you see things from both sides. You're seeing, the left and the right and the right and the left, the black and the white and the white and the black. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. In the days of the 50s, there was a complete segregation in the area where I lived, and I think probably all over the South. It was the area was segregated completely. Blacks went to their schools, whites went to their school. It was just a different time than it is today.
Hmm. And when you're talking about sharecropping, you get into the tobacco fields, and we're going through a change. So let's start with tobacco being an industry, because the industry was huge and it fed people. Some people weren't making as much money, like the sharecroppers, but the actual farm owners do. And when you drive the back roads of North Carolina and the farming communities, you can see here on the little hill, because there's not many mountains there at that point, in Western North Carolina. Yeah, but you'll see here's the big farmhouse, and then that's not where the people are that were really working the fields as much back in those days, right? I
That
think
is
everybody gets their hands in it, though. I mean, you can't have a farm without getting your hands dirty somewhere. um, but at that point, tobacco kind of reminds me of what coal was for Kentucky, and those areas that were coal mining. And then we've had to have these huge changes because that's actually life, isn't it? These
that's
changes.
the South was very poor after the war, after the Civil War, and for a while, cotton was what people depended on to keep their houses, lit and everything. That was how they made their money. And then cotton became, you couldn't, the boll weevil came along, and cotton simply, the prices were up and down. And all of a sudden, tobacco showed up, and it became a way of life. People
Mm,
were able to survive and to make money and to feed their families because of tobacco.
mm. And this was, and when I mentioned Kentucky, this was also kind of this was also happening in Kentucky at the same time, right? With the tobacco fields.
That's correct. A different
Mm.
kind. This was what we call flue-cured tobacco in North Carolina, and Kentucky had tobacco called burley tobacco.
Oh,
So
wow.
we had tobacco here, and as a rule, most of the farms were farmed by sharecroppers, both white and black.
Mm,
It came from a history of, I guess, slavery and after the war, and people sort of migrated to working on the farm, but they didn't own the farm. The Depression
mm,
took away anyone who owned a farm, owned a piece of land. They lost it during the Depression in the 30s, and so it wound up in the hands of just a few people, and they were able to make sure that the farm operated through sharecroppers. It was a way of life.
Mm. And the sharecroppers, it was kind of like I remember being in sales many years ago, and they had this like you were getting like a salary on the draw. So it was like you were almost going to the company store. You know what I mean? And I feel that way with the sharecropping. So if you can explain that for folks about how sharecroppers you you were kind of connected to the farm, but it was like you always kind of owed them money in a way. You know what I mean?
Right. You were very vulnerable. You
Mm,
you planted your crop of tobacco in the spring. You harvested in the fall, harvested in the summer, and sold it in the fall. And then you got the money from the sale, and that's what you had to last you through the year. And most of the time, there were several circumstances. There would be a bad storm or a hailstorm, but many times sharecroppers did not have enough to make it from one season to the next. It was
mm.
a dangerous time and a hard time, really, for the
So
share.
they were taking the same risk as the farm owner.
Yes, but the farm owner had more assets. They had no assets. They didn't even
Yeah.
own land. The only thing they owned was the personal property and the sharecropping house.
And so when you look at the change of tobacco going away, and I mean, obviously there's still tobacco, and we still hear some crazy stories about, kids, migrant kid workers being kind of owned. It's almost like I don't want to say a slave trade, but it is almost kind of like that right now in some of the farming where some of the farms are hiring kids that are migrants, coming over the border. And we hear that now in certain areas. There's certain reports of that. And it's kind of sad to hear. And I'm not speaking just on North Carolina whatsoever, but it's throughout our country that these kids are ending up working in them. But at the sharecroppers, wouldn't in the 50s, weren't the kids also working alongside their parents?
Absolutely. A landowner wanted a sharecropper who had lots of children because they needed the children to work in the fields. They needed help, and one of the reasons sharecropping died out was because all the kids who were children of the sharecroppers did not like the work they were doing. They thought it was very hard. They wanted to move somewhere. The black kids, the African American kids, they wanted to go up north where they could find a job. So sharecropping became harder and harder. Plus,
Mm.
the farms began to consolidate and become large, and the sharecroppers just did not fit in. They were used to a small acreage, but these large acreage were beginning to take place, and it became a real problem for sharecropping. And so they were pushed out of the farms, and migrant workers came from Florida to start with. They came
Oh,
up the coast. They would stop in South Carolina and harvest fruits and vegetables and tobacco. Then they moved from like Charleston and Georgia on up the coast, and they'd arrive in eastern North Carolina around the 1st of June, and they would uh, take the crop, harvest the crop, and then they would leave and go to Virginia on up into Chesapeake. So the
mm.
migrants,
Wow.
ones who took the place of the sharecroppers.
Wow. So, and that's where we are now in a way, right? It's
But
kind
yeah,
of,
but there are more controls, and the migrants now mostly are
mhm.
Mexicans, not African Americans.
Right, right. So let's go to Talmadge Farm and look at who the people are in this story because this is a good thing. I love historical fiction because it proves that history is a bunch of gossip. I mean, obviously we have wars, but there's always gossip, right? And historical fiction attaches us to history. And I mean, this is more modern history, right? But it attaches us to history because we're living through people's stories. So we get to understand what was going on in the times more than, when you're in school and you will know this year and you will know this date line, which means nothing to us, right? As kids. This when you're storytelling, we get an appreciation and an understanding of people. So let's start with who owns Talmadge Farm, and then we'll get to the sharecroppers.
Well, Gordon Talmadge owned the farm. He inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his father. So it goes way back in time. It's 1,800 acres in one tract, which is very unusual. It abuts a river called the Neuse River. And Gordon has a pretty wife and two sons. One is named Junior, and one is named David. That's the Talmadge family. There are two
Mm.
sharecropping families. One is the Sanders family. That's Will, Ivy, and their daughter Ella, and their son. They have another family, a white family called the Craddocks. That's I'm sorry, that's Will Craddock and his daughter Mary Grace. And so there are two families, one black, one white that are sharecroppers working on the Talmadge farm
And living there.
and living there and have all their life. Ivy not only works on the farm, she is the maid for the Gordons in
Mm.
the farmhouse. And she cooks for them. She is a maid, and her mother was a maid. It's typical in those days that the black family or the white family would be the maid in the big house, we call
Mm. And what's in, yeah, the big house. It's always called the big house, right? And it's interesting. The big house is because the maids also help even during childbirth and all kinds of things. I mean, and it's scary for them. They go through some hell, literally.
it.
It could be, well, people have to read. I don't want to give anything away too, but tell us a little bit about the women, because you get into the women's history too, because this really was a change in what was going on in the country and in North Carolina. And I think, in the South, there's ways, and then it's like change is coming. And we're like, no, it's my land. Get off my land, kind of thing. It's like there's a shift that was difficult, but the women are strong in your book.
Women are the real heroes in my book. The Ivy, who looks after her family, has a strong backbone and is determined to make sure her children get a fair shake and get off the farm. Will Craddock has a daughter named Mary Grace, whose mother died, and she and the Will are there together. They had a number of miscarriages before she died, and so it's just the two of them. And he wants more than anything for her to be successful. He doesn't
Hmm.
like being white and being compared to a family that is black. And he
Wow.
doesn't understand why he doesn't get treated better than they do. But they are really on equal basis economically, even though they
Hmm.
don't go to the same school or same church. So we got those two families, and then the inner workings between all those people make this story. And you see the demise of the sharecroppers over a period of about 10 or 12 years, and they
Wow.
finally have to leave. And so that's really the name, what the reason for the book.
Wow. And so what inspired you? I mean, obviously living out there and growing up in this region, right? But
Yeah,
what was it that made you think, was it just that time, that era of change? Because change really, I mean, it's hard. Change is probably one of the most difficult things we can all go through in life. And it's something we have to, no matter what we want. We're going to go through change. I don't care who we are.
that was really hard for the Talmadge family to understand that the world was changing. They were very close to Raleigh, which is the home of the Research Triangle Park. And you could see that people are beginning to diversify, that there were companies coming there. IBM came and a number of others started moving into the area, and it was attracting jobs, people wanting jobs. And the farm was still there, but really you could see change was beginning to take place in that area, and it continues to take place.
Hmm. It still is now. I mean, I even Durham has all those, like the FedEx warehousing things, and all of that. Like
We have
it seems like,
Apple.
and
Yeah,
yeah,
we have
Apple, and then you've got all the Well, the whole Tri-City, right? The Tri-City area in is Winston-Salem, Durham and Raleigh, and you got the university too, and that changes everything.
Yeah, that's why they put the Research Triangle Park in the research
No,
area because
is it Winston-Salem? Am I getting my states mixed up or Winston Chapel? What?
in this area. There was Duke University, North
Hmm.
Carolina State, and the University of North Carolina within about 20 miles of each other. So they
Wow.
placed this Research Triangle Park right in the middle of those universities to take
Okay.
advantage of the research that they could avail these big companies.
Wow, I didn't realize that's why it's called the Tri-City area
Yeah,
because
that
of that.
was called Research Triangle Park.
Wow, I had no clue about that. It seems that whole area, just with all the commerce that's happening, the growth, I think when you have university, there's a youthfulness that always happens to an area. It keeps progression moving. It doesn't stop when you have a university in town. And then at the same time, you're having, like you're saying, Apple and all these companies. Is it kind of wild to think, like, to reflect back to the 50s to now? And, it's like, what, 75 years later, basically. Like, how did this happen so fast?
Well, it happened, and then I think it was gradual. It didn't happen overnight, but it started happening in the late 50s. There
Mm.
was a number of inventions that started the mobilization, I mean, the mechanization of farm equipment to raise tobacco. So that was coming on. And then the uh, the idea of a sharecropper with a small tract of land just wasn't working out.
Mm.
They couldn't survive on it. The children didn't want to stay, and so that created the drama in the book.
Mm. So, with all this change, what happens to the sharecropper families when they leave? I mean, do they have to go into new careers or?
They had to go get new careers.
Wow.
They all had to find their way. And most of the older sharecroppers were really glad for their children to get off the farm, but they had nowhere
Yeah.
to. So the story is about how they wound up.
Does having universities help for hope for education when you're in like a sharecropper circumstances economically? You want your kids to do well because you see there's universities, you see these institutions that, here, we want you to go there. Do you think that helped in the storyline, knowing that these institutions were growing and building around?
Well, when I helped one particular boy who was the child of the Sanders family, Jake,
Mhm.
he went to college because he had to leave. He gotten in trouble, and so he had to leave, and so he wound up in a university up north, Villanova, in Philadelphia. But the rest of the children had didn't know anything about the
Mm.
universities. They were trying to find the black children thought maybe they ought to go into the army. Most of them did. They thought that was a way out. Uh,
Mhm.
So they would join the army and try to get into the 82nd Airborne because that was stationed in Fort Bragg, which is near where we live. And so they would
Mhm.
all try to join the army. The there was there started to be community colleges which were able to teach nursing and truck driving and things like that. And so they were trying to create a way for a person to get a trade that they could use as they got older.
What about the actual tobacco industry themselves? Because when you look at the history of the tobacco industry, it's fascinating because, I mean, they had glamorized it so much, and movie stars were smoking, women were smoking. That's kind of a weird thing too when you think about women, back in the day. It's like women should be seen and not heard, just like kids, right? And women and men were separated at times, just, I'm thinking way back when, right? Then we're getting to this part where women would smoke, and it was romantic, it was sexy, it was used in film and everything, and that was kind of the start of women's liberation also, like women starting to wear pants, smoke cigarettes, and Rosie the Riveters, all of that kind of, when you think all of that movement through World War II, where women stepped in into World War II and really did things. And we had nurses, in World War II, overseas, which were in some very difficult predicaments. Then you look at, here's the tobacco industry, and the tobacco industry was prevalent through World War II. It was through everything, right? So the 50s, we now start to hear, oh, it may not be so good. And then it's kind of like what the pharmaceutical companies are having to deal with right now. Like, hello, what did we do? So was there any payment from the tobacco companies, or were they, I mean, because they made tons of money, right? So
Absolutely.
so that I know it got, I mean, we still have tobacco, and tobacco is such a beautiful plant. The Nicotiana, we used to actually grow some of it for hummingbirds when we lived out in the desert, but it was like a wild tobacco, native tobacco plant. But when you think of, now they start to lose their business, even though they have gazillions of millions, right? The actual farmers, you're sitting high on your hill, but you know your hill's about to crumble with this. Sharecroppers are definitely at the bottom, right? Then you've got people with health issues that it's been probably covered up for so long. Like, there, we didn't give you cancer. We didn't do this to your kids, so this whole change of what everybody thought was fine. I mean, even remember candy cigarettes, Lucky Strike candy cigarettes? They were getting us as kids to smoke. I mean, and we're still battling this in a way, not just pharmaceuticals, but there's still smoking out there. So what was it like at that time? Did the tobacco companies ever have to help and pay back for the damage?
Well, I think there have been lawsuits over the years regarding harmful effects of tobacco, but tobacco still is a big industry in the United States and all over the country. Many countries, and particularly Asia, there is a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people who smoke, and there are tobacco that is grown in the United States that is sent to the Far East
Oh, wow.
to make cigarettes. And so it is a big business right on. And people here grow tobacco as they did years ago, but they are large industrial farms with hundreds, thousands of acres rather than a sharecropper with 4 or 5 acres. It has changed dramatically, but it's certainly not over. And if you look at the companies themselves, RJ Reynolds, they were the reasons for Wake Forest to grow as a great university. Duke University was is because of the tobacco company, American Tobacco Company, and a man named Duke, Mr. Duke. So tobacco
Oh,
really has
oh,
made this state what it is. But
wow.
and people remember and appreciate tobacco, and it's a sort of a I don't know what you'd call it exactly, but you've got tobacco that helped everybody and tobacco that hurt it.
Well, that's the same as mining, right? You go into a community, you mine, and the mining, they had company towns, and if the mine closed and the company stores closed, and people were sitting there in the middle of nowhere with nothing there, and the mining communities they always give to the community, like in a big way, schools, everything like you're talking about. Yet, it's like, we're here, we're taking your resources, we're gonna keep you nice and quiet and fed over this way. You know what I mean? It's kind of it's a payout in a way, right?
That's the way, and they were good citizens, as you say. The tobacco
Mm-hmm.
companies were great citizens, and they were very generous, giving money to certain charitable groups, and they were appreciated.
Wow. So it is what it is, right? And that's the thing to look at in history. It is what it is.
It's what it is, and people understand that uh, it was a good thing for the people in North Carolina for many, many years.
Mm,
But things change, and they
mm,
change sometimes gradually and sometimes quickly. And
mm.
that's the way the tobacco industry has evolved in North Carolina.
Well, it's kind of interesting too when you think about sharecropping, and it wasn't an easy life at all. It's not necessarily something we want to keep around, but we're losing jobs all the time to machines and AI. And you kind of go like, where are we at this point? I mean, it's getting to like, where's the person at the checkout? We go to a grocery store, you need to bag your own groceries and the prices aren't getting any lower over it, but you get to do it yourself. We're looking at all these. I mean, that's just the way life is. It's going to change, sometimes for the good, sometimes not for the good. And I think that's where history reminds us of the past, of how and why. What was it that led you to write a novel?
I wanted to write about the sharecroppers, and I wanted to write about a period in history that very few people knew about. I think the 50s were sort of uneventful. They were just like the women in the 50s. It was before the pill. So they were,
Oh, before Loretta Lynn got to sing about it.
that's, it was a different attitude. Women would not get a divorce. That was just the worst thing in the world. And the idea of getting pregnant out of wedlock was
Oh,
it just wouldn't happen. And so it was not a good time for women. But as the 60s came along, that's when the revolution took place and changed everything.
mm. It's funny because we always think about the music and you think California hippies, but it's actually about what's going on. And I always think about what happens on farms around the country and around the world, these small farms, as things change, and how women have been kind of cloistered into a farm. Like they can't actually leave at that point. And society and divorce, you're kind of stuck there. And you're raising kids, and your husband could be whatever, and you're kind of stuck. I always thought that could isolate you, and yet you still have a community, but it's not like you can just go on a Google map and drive your car. It's different.
It's
you know
completely correct.
wow. Wow, amazing times. Are you going to write another novel?
Getting pretty old. I'm going to see how this one does. I don't know whether, it's when you write a book, you're really hoping that people like the book. I'm sure they're going to love the characters, and I think
Hmm.
they'll like the story. So it will depend on how well they accept this book.
Well, I think it's important because, when we think about like the tobacco industry, there's an immediate negative, right? Because we know of the health thing, but you have to look at all sides.
Yeah,
Like
it
that,
was
you're a lawyer, you know how to do that.
built in this town where this takes place. It's a fictional town called Hobbsfield, and the sign going into town says, "Welcome to Hobbsfield, the town that tobacco made."
Wow. That's it. That you just said it right there. Well, it's true because I mean, you got to also think about the government taking away alcohol and saying prohibition. I mean, that was rude. I mean, there's a line of rights of like how far are you going to take things away. So I think that's the other angle that comes into play here, is like, oh, it may be bad for me, but that's my choice.
Yep, that's right.
you, so now Asia gets it. Oh, that's amazing. So when you think about what's going on in the world, like we always think about how we import things from Asia, but if things get cut off from Asia, this could affect the tobacco farmers here. And we don't really hear that on the news that much.
No, and they're growing tobacco in other countries like Brazil and in Africa. But really, the quality tobacco is still grown in the United States.
Wow, good information. Well, this has been fun having you on the show. Thank you so much. I love this, and I love that you're doing like historical fiction in the time frame that you're doing it. And I know that especially people in North Carolina are going to really love this. But definitely, any Southern fiction you can't beat, right? It always runs deep, and there's always an element of magic somewhere. There's mystery and magic in all Southern fiction, don't you think, Leo?
And so,
I think so too. Everyone, the book is out June 4th, 2024, and you can go to leodaughtry.com, of course, pre-order it, and on Amazon, all those places. Thank you so much for listening to us here on Big Blend Radio. Thank you so much, Leo.
and thank you, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah, absolutely, because you're going to write another one.
I don't know, Lisa. We'll see.
Come on, everyone, buy his book. I want another one.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to Big Blend Radio. Keep up with our shows at bigblendradio.com.